Good afternoon. I am Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of Central European University, and I'm delighted to see you here. I extend an especially warm welcome to our colleagues and friends from the Vienna community. I see some very distinguished people here, ambassadors, former ambassadors, pillars of the Austrian diplomatic service and international presence. I see Ludek Sekira here who's come all the way from Prague. I see lots of people, so a shout out to everybody would go on for another 20 minutes, and I shouldn't do that, but my point here is to extend the warmest possible welcome to our Austrian and colleagues. As everybody knows, CEU is the new kid on the block in Austria, so we're particularly delighted to welcome you to our quarters here in Favoriten. On my left, Ivan Krastev, Chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. I've always wondered what those liberal strategies are in Sofia, but and strategic, permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and we are delighted that we're co-hosting this event with IWM, which is a pillar of intellectual life in Vienna, and they've been wonderful friends to us, and so it's great to have you here. On my right, Stephen Holmes, Walter Mayer, Professor of Law at NYU. The two of them, incredibly, have combined to write a book. I don't know how many of you have ever written a book with someone else, but it ain't easy, and somehow they've done it. And it is both fluid, beautifully worked together so that you don't see the joins between the intellectual styles of the two authors. But it's an extremely important book that gets us to think about the entire history of Central and Eastern Europe and Europe in general since 1989, and has a number of extremely important arguments to make about the role of emulation and the role of resentment in driving these processes in ways that have produced very unexpected results since 1989. And that analysis and that argument has got a great deal of attention internationally, and so we're especially glad that they are here to talk to us about it. What we're going to do is that I'm going to ask each of them to just talk to you very briefly, 3-5 minutes apiece, about what they think the most important arguments they're trying to make. Then we'll have a brief discussion. I've got a few bones to pick with them, not too many, 2 in fact. And then we want to get out to the audience, and there will be mics that circulate so that, because we want to pick up the discussion so that everybody else can hear. And we will wrap sort of by 6:30, 25 to 7. So we have an hour to do this, and let's get going. I don't know which of you wants to start. Stephen?
Ivan's going to start.
Oh, Ivan.
Yeah.
Ivan.
So I'll start much more trying to tell you what we wanted to do, which does not need to be the same that we did. And then basically, Stephen is going to outline our major argument on imitation. But first, let's say how grateful we are to be here, and this is historical reasons for this. The first thing that we did jointly, we were invited by Yehuda Elkana, and we did a joint course some years ago in the CEU on the first generation of neoconservatives. And it was an absolutely great experience teaching a course together. So probably we owe to the university more than we're saying. But secondly, we didn't start this book in the way it is. We believe that we're writing a book on Russia. And in a certain way, we have been doing work on Russia before. We had the feeling that we have an interesting perspective talking to each other about Russia. And we came with a project for a book which we gave to a big American publishing house, making a very simple argument. And the argument was the following. Everything that we see in Russia, we were seeing as problems coming from the past. And our question was, could it be that some of the problems that we see in Russia are coming not from the past but from the future? Could it be that certain things that basically we see as specifically Russian aberrations had been part of the new normal, and we were talking about, for example, suddenly you discover Russia is not a place that you exploit people, they're exploiting nature because of oil and gas. But what if technology is going to play the same role in the Western societies? You have a democratic elections, but these elections are much more to legitimize governments than to replace governments. So we came with all these stories, and the publisher, who was very friendly to us, he said, listen, it's fine, but it's too excessive. It was 2008, 2009, so he said, Russia could not be the future of anything. And then basically situation started to develop, and we started to figure out and ask two very simple questions. One is, we were seeing Central and Eastern Europe, we have been talking a lot about this, we're seeing Russia, after Trump came, we're seeing the United States, and the question was, they're very different cases. Trying to come with a general theory, particularly of populism, we found it not particularly productive. But there was something similar in a kind of a broader way, and our question was, to what extent this is rooted in the legacy of 1989 itself? To what extent basically what we see, we can see in the way of the nature of the post-Cold War period? So then we went to reread all the major kind of explanation and intuition about the post-Cold War world that came up with the end of communism. And here there's three things that for us were quite important. First, the fact that the end of communism came very unexpectedly by everybody make people believe, both East and the West, that it was not that communism was defeated by the United States or by liberalism, but that history itself defeated it. Secondly, the fact that it was kind of mysterious, and particularly from the Russian side, they never understood why the Soviet Union collapsed. Make this kind of a conspiracy thinking a kind of a new common sense, because you never basically understand what happened. And thirdly, I do believe what was quite interesting for us is that the Cold War was such a major clash between two different universalist projects that at the end of the day, the end of the Cold War meant, and this is how we interpreted the end of history of Fukuyama, that modernity is simply the other name of democratic capitalism. There was only one model that was worth imitating. It was not that somebody is imposing something on anybody else. So from this point of view, our idea of imitation has nothing to do with the idea of a colonization of the East by the West. This is the argument which I'm not buying at all. But at the same time, there was something structurally important to see. There was no alternatives. There was the idea of normality. And for us, the idea of normality is a very kind of a central concept in the idea of the post-1989 world was critically important. And then we came with the idea that this kind of 30 years, which we defined as the Age of Imitation, paradoxically explain the nature of the resentment coming from the illiberal forces, which do not come with the alternative ideology. This is why we basically said what we see is much more a psychological reaction against being an imitator than any type of an alternative, any type of a thick ideology that comes with a different explanation of the world. And I'll stop here and go to Stephen.
Thanks, Ivan. And thank you, Michael, for having us here, and thank you all for coming. So, as Ivan said, our project was to explain, or to try to understand, how we went from 1989, where liberalism was celebrated and triumphant, you might say, to today, where liberalism is derided and not defeated, but let's say embattled. And the most common, I think, excuse me, in the literature today, I think the most common explanation is simply that I would call it, or you might call it, the meaningless parenthesis theory of transition. That is just nothing really happened, and we've now gone back to after communist period was over, the liberal period is over, there's been a return to the nativist and authoritarian DNA that's in the region. And the problem, I mean, this way of thinking has many things wrong with it. First of all, just methodologically, saying that we explain the way things are now because they remind us of the way things used to be is not a good way to go. Not only that, but today's populism is very different than the populism of the 30s. We have an aging society, afraid of the future. This was not the 1930s nativism at all. So our project was to say, let's look at the language used by the populists in, say, Poland and Hungary, and see what they're saying. And it turns out that two of the most important claims being made against the liberal idea against the transitional period is, we don't want to imitate anymore. We want to be ourselves. We're tired of copying. Being a copy, being a crappy copy, an inadequate copy, a botched replica is not a good place to be. And not only that, but we resent enormously the idea that there's no alternative to liberal democracy. And those statements of important populist leaders and spokesmen and intellectuals struck us very strongly, because that's exactly what Fukuyama said in 1989. Liberal democracy is the only available model. It has no alternative, and it's going to conquer and the only path forward is to imitate liberal democracy. So it made us think maybe you should look at the imitation imperative. And democratization, liberalization, you can think about it in many ways, but one thing democratization was imitation of the West. Now, as Ivan said, one of the people like Havel and Michnik and others were saying, we are tired of experiments. Communism was an experiment. We want to do something. We want to just have a normal life. Normal didn't mean going back to the way Poland was before communism. It meant being like the West. We don't want any experiments. We want to just be like the West. However, you have to think about it for a second to realize that if you transfer a fully worked out model from one society into another, you're going to be doing an experiment. Something's going to happen you didn't expect. So just the most obvious example is if you take a standard model Thatcherite privatization and put it into a society with no private capital, what's going to happen is the communist managers are going to use the assets of the enterprises to steal all the public patrimony of the country. This, of course, produces resentment. So there's a case of imitation, producing resentment, because of the unmerited inequality created. But not only that, but the language of liberalism, which you're supposed to be taking over from the West, is inadequate to explain that abuse. The language of liberalism, as Michael and many others know, is focused mostly on violations of individual rights. But when you steal the public patrimony, you're not violating individual rights. It's nonetheless a terrible abuse. So there was a loss of this ability to even formulate in the language of liberalism. And another point we make very strongly here in the book is that in 1989, the highest liberal gain of the end of communism was the freedom of movement, the ability to leave your country. Today, the great trauma of many East European countries is depopulation, not only low birth rate, but one-child families, people leaving. You cannot formulate that anxiety, that trauma, that injury in the language of 1989, which is the language of freedom of movement. So this is and then one last point here about normality. So this is basically it's what I was saying, that normality being just like the West is there's that total paradox of producing something nobody expected. And this is partly the question we begin the book is, why didn't we expect this to happen? Why didn't we see any of this? And that's because we came to the world with a lack of understanding of the kinds of traumas that one of the reasons, and there are of course many, and this is, our book, it does not claim to be a final explanation, but we were not aware of the kinds of traumas that were going to be created by this reform by imitation.
Just two more kind of things on this imitation. For a person who was very important for us was the French philosopher René Girard. Girard, by the way, made all his career. He was obsessed with the idea of imitation. He was explaining everything through imitation. But he got one thing particularly right from our point of view. He said, listen, The moment I want to be like you, there's three important implications. First, I recognize that you are better than me. Secondly, I have a problem with my own identity. But certainly it's antagonistic relations. If I want to be like you, I want to replace you. I want to be on your place. So from this point of view, Fukuyama was quite, I do believe that Fukuyama was misinterpreted and people are kind of very freely ridiculing and so on. He got something very much right. He understood that there was a major rupture, that modernity and democratic capitalism went together. So this was not this naive story of his, and he never was very much triumphalist about what is going to happen. For him, the end of history world was not the world that he particularly liked. But what he didn't realize is the antagonistic nature of imitation. And we came with three different stories about imitations because in three different parts of the book and three different parts of the world. In the case of Central and Eastern Europe, our major story was Central and East Europeans really wanted to be like the West. It was genuine, it came from us, and it resulted first in the fact that if the idea of the future moved from ahead of time, next in space. So the paradox effect of this idea of revolution of normality was that the liberals were the first to leave their countries after the liberal revolution because the revolutionaries always want to live in the future, and the future of Poland was Germany. So you simply want to see how the future functions. The second thing that was important also for us is to try to show that in the case of Russia, imitation was not a choice. Russia basically was a state that had lost identity. Basically, we spent quite a lot of time explaining why it was very difficult to the Russians to buy the narrative that they have won the Cold War II. They didn't feel like the winners. So for them, the imitation, particularly in the last decade, became the way to subvert the liberal order without the need to come with any alternative. And from this point of view, for us, it was very important to show that the major message coming from President Putin was, in the 1990s, we were imitating the wrong thing, Western institution. What should be imitating is the American foreign policy. And the major story of the imitation is not to say that we want to be like you because we like you, to say you're not better than us. And we're always giving one example in order to try to understand where we're going. There was something that in foreign policy people lie. It's normally not the heads of states that are doing this. And normally people lie in politics when they can deny certain things. And then suddenly, the second day after basically the Russian special forces entered Crimea, the Russian president personally said there was no Russian special force in Crimea. Listen, this is a lie that cannot be sustained because in 10 hours you're going to know the names of the people. Why he's doing this? And our major story is he's doing this not because he tried to hide the facts. Deception is not about lying. Deception is about provocation. Because he lied in order to be called a liar, in order to say liar like you. What about the weapons for mass destruction in Iraq? He's saying, he's provoking this in order to say, I'm lying, so what you can do? And from this point of view, for us, our Russian idea of imitation as a strategy of subversion, where you're basically saying, I'm going to do like you in order to show how fake and hypocritical your world is, explains the fact that you can get a very strong, even popular support outside of your country without offering any type of alternative set of values and norms. And the third story, which was the most interesting, and of course Stephen has much more to say about this than me, comes the biggest surprise. Why Central Europeans can dislike the Age of Imitation is fine. Why the Russians, it's much easier to explain. But how it happened that the Americans, which created and dominated the post-Cold War world, were managed by President Trump, at least many of them, that the America is the biggest victim. That America is the biggest loser of the world that imitates America. And here we're making a story saying in the world of business from which Trump is coming, imitator is the worst competitor. He's taking all your competitive advantages for free. and also what is critically important, and we're demonstrating this on the example of the spread of the English language, suddenly your major advantages starts to look like your vulnerability. Just to give this example before ending on this. Listen, for 2 decades, the spread of the English language was perceived as the biggest demonstration of the Americanization of the world, of the fact that the globalization very much works in the favor of the United States. And then suddenly, Americans realized 3 simple things. The fact that many people in the world speaks English means that when an American goes to a place, you're always going to find an English speaker, so there is no need to learn foreign languages, major decline of the foreign languages learning in the American education system. But secondly, you're talking to the English speakers and you believe that you understand the country in which you go. The English speakers are not always the most representative part of the societies. Secondly, you suddenly understand that you're becoming transparent to the world, but the world is becoming totally non-transparent for you. There was this famous story in which the current Russian Minister of Defense, when he was appointed by President Putin told him, and you're going to deal with the Americans, and don't spend much time basically learning about it, just watch the House of Cards, everything is there. So suddenly, basically, you become vulnerable because they know, for example, the Chinese know very well in what kind of goods they should put pressure in order to affect American elections. Everybody knows what the battle states in the American elections, so if you're going to come with the economic sanctions and trades and others, you know how to influence American politics. But how Americans should know how to influence Bulgarian politics? Mm-hmm. So suddenly what was perceived as your major advantage is becoming your major vulnerability, and I do believe this type of a psychological term explains something that goes much more beyond Trump. Yeah.
Do you want to add something at this point?
I can add a couple things, but maybe you would like to ask a question.
Well, let me say, first of all, this is a book and an analysis from which I learned an immense amount. I think this dialectic between emulation, the only way to go is to imitate us, and the resentment that generates has real explanatory power. But what if this analysis ends up justifying these illiberal Democrats in ways that you didn't intend? What if this explanation becomes justification? Because there's a way of hearing this that says, Viktor Orban's conservative nationalism, we must defend Hungary, we must keep Hungary Hungary, we must protect Hungary from the European Union. We must protect Hungary from these external threats. We must protect Hungary from migration. You're saying, I'm pushing you. What's not to like? This is a very persuasive response to the resentments that you're describing, so that you back yourself into an analysis which is very, very powerful, but it takes you to a place you actually don't want to go, which is these reactionary nationalists understood something about their own electorates that smarty pants Western liberals didn't understand. And so the analysis ends up beating us up, right? What's not to like about beating us up? God knows we got a lot wrong, but it has the inadvertent and unexpected effect of making Viktor Orban look like a genius, when in fact there's a simpler story here which you may not be focusing on, which is this guy saw the chaos of post-89 liberalization. He reacted like a smart Bolshevik, which is get power, hold power, create a national bourgeoisie, steal everything that isn't bolted down, eliminate all competing institutions as fast as you can, and hold on to power in perpetuity. What's not to like about that? And then you exploit the resentments, right? You exploit the resentments, but you've got yourself into a situation where you appear to be legitimizing his rule when what in fact he's doing, he doesn't care about the resentment. He doesn't care about the fact that his electorate feels that they're being asked to emulate societies they don't really like. What he wants is power. And you've ended up legitimizing power, his pursuit of power. That would be the knock.
Okay, I mean, that's fine. I mean, I so object to this way of thinking that, Helvetius attacked Montesquieu. He said, you have justified feudalism by explaining why it happened. So we're talking about what are the factors. I mean, of course, Orban, there's particular events that are occurring. He can be shrewd. There are accidents of history that allowed him to do this, and he's a kleptocrat, so all that's true. But there are conditions. So, for example, one of the conditions on which he's exploited is that Westernization occurred in a multi-speed way. Some sections of society imitated very fast, and some sections were very low. This creates resentment in the society. That's a factor that contributes. Or let's take the example of harmonization, where because liberal reformers were eager to adapt to the rules of post-national Europe, they let national symbols and national traditions on the floor to be picked up by a counter-elite like Orban. They left it there. It's not, to blame or to justify. This is how this occurred. And of course, people weren't seeing it as something, even though we all knew that in 1989, part of the reason for the Velvet Revolution was nationalist revolt against Moscow. It was there implicitly. Maybe we should have paid more attention to it, you could say. But I don't think anything you say is justification. If to say, you can attack, as I would do and you would do too, almost everything Trump does, I find odious and unbearable. Nonetheless, he's supported by a huge number of people. How do you explain that? Yeah. And to explain it isn't to justify him. And in fact, this is something Ivan and I were talking about, before Brexit and before Trump, we didn't realize how bad things had become in our societies. It's a revelation. The fact that someone like Orban could win is a revelation about the society. And that's not justification. It's to understand it, I would say. But
I'll go, because for me this is also quite interesting. And there is one story with all these illiberal regimes. If you compare how we have been trying to study Soviets, it was serious. You're studying Soviet Union, you believe it's serious, it's ideology and so on. When you go basically studying, be it Russia, being Hungary, we are saying that everything is about corruption. Corruption is part of the regime, and basically eliminating corruption, not simply of people wanting to become rich, but using corruption basically to keep power is important. But if somebody is going to try to convince me that the major rationale for somebody who for 20 years is a president of a nuclear power like Putin, that everything that he is doing is simply to increase his bank account, I found this psychologically ridiculous. Only badly paid assistant professors can believe that this is true. And for me, this is it's a very important. And from this point of view, there is two interesting things that you can easily dismiss, saying Hungary is about corruption. By the way, Poland, and going with Kaczynski is not personally corrupt.
The story I was telling you wasn't about corruption, Ivan, it was about power. And the ways in which the resentment story and the emulation story provide the electoral ground that Orban exploits.
Well, why is that justification?
No, but listen, it's even more interesting because power, of course, is there, and I do believe this is the major objective of most of these people. But the interesting question is, and here Poland is more interesting than Hungary, because in Hungary, because of the nature of the constitutional majority that he got, he managed to capture the state very early on, so you really cannot understand where people stay, because the system was very much distorted in institutional terms. But the story is why Polish society, with the history that they have a very strong resistance to a communist dictatorship and others, allows somebody to come and to say separation of powers is against our interest and so on and so on. And here is part of our explanation. Our explanation is that people start to believe, and this is where they succeeded, telling people, do you know what? Separation of power is not against me or my party, this is against you. Because you're voting for somebody And then the government said, I cannot do it because of the central bank, I cannot do it because of the European Union, I cannot do it because of the judges. So the message of what Mr. Kaczynski is defining as legal impossibilism is, give me the power if you want what you voted for to be realized. So this is the revolutionary understanding of politics in a society which believed that they're in a revolution and their revolution was castrated.
And one of the points that seems to me, having criticized you, one of the things that I learned a lot from it is exactly on that point, that liberal constitutionalism, that is checks and balances, courts, independent regulators, independent central banks, depends on certain social professions, lawyers, experts, accountants, economists, professors. And Kaczynski and Orban have been brilliant at turning the public against these liberal elites and discrediting the institutional checks and balances that they defend. He's turned the attack on liberal constitutionalism into a kind of class war. That's an implication of what you.
Yeah.
Am I reading you right?
You're absolutely right. And there is one country which is the most important to understand our argument, and this is the country in which populists are not in power, and this is East Germany. I mean Germany, the case of Eastern Germany. If everything is about only manipulation, basically getting power and trying to use power for power's sake, you're never going to understand basically what is happening in East Germany and why you had this such high vote for AfD, particularly keeping in mind that the refugee crisis, of course, triggered many important things, but there are not so many refugees in the eastern part of Germany. I'm saying this because the obsession with Germany that you can see both in the case of Hungary and Poland, and of course they have also historical connotations, but one of the interesting things is that when we talk about imitation, for Central and East European countries, the country to imitate was Germany. Because Germany was the copy that was better than the original. They themselves went through the transition, imitating the United States, coming with a political system, and it worked. And I'm going to give you just 3 reasons why for Central and East Europeans, particularly for Poland, imitating Germany was not easy. One is, in 1945, nationalism was the defeated party. What happened basically is the nationalism destroyed these countries and so on. In 1989, nationalists were part of the victorious coalition against communism. People really forget how important some of the nationalistic politicians have been in the first Solidarity coalitions and others. These people, they said, we're not going to treat our nationalism in the way basically Germans treated their nationalism because it was totally different. So the interesting question is not why nationalism re-emerged. The interesting question is where it has been hiding for the 10 years and why. And one of the reasons is that the idea of the sovereignty then also means getting out of the Soviet sphere of influence. So joining the European Union was also the agenda of the sovereignists. The second was the Yugoslavia. And this is one thing that we unfortunately lack in the book. Probably we're going to do it something else. But Yugoslavia was perceived as total aberration. Now, if you're going to read what happened through the Yugoslav experience, you're going to see how important basically the Yugoslav experience was. And one of the important stories about the Yugoslav experience was that for people like Kaczynski, because of Milosevic, they lost their language. Because nationalism was there, but political biography of somebody like Kaczynski, strongly anti-communist and others, cannot be associated with ex-communists like Milosevic. So for 10 years, they didn't have a language. They were muted because of the Yugoslav war, you see the bloody face of nationalism, and secondly, because nationalism was very much taken by the ex-communists. And the third thing, which for me is very important, is Germany was normality, but this is what is interesting when you imitate a really existing society. Imitating Christ or imitating communist society was good because they never change. They were eternal. But imagine that in 1989 you're a conservative Pole. What do you like about the West? First, you like that the West believes in God, believes in conservative values. It is strongly anti-communist and strongly anti-leftist. But for these 30 years, the West has changed a lot. And then the idea we are cheated. We basically wanted to imitate the West that believes in God, and now you're telling me that society should be secular, and we believed in Christianity and this and that. So from this point of view, the idea of normality suddenly clashes between the normality and the idea of normal society that East Europeans imagined in 1989 that they're imitating, and the really existing Western society that are changing. So for us, it was also very important to stress in the book that there are tensions between the normality within every society. Because, and I do believe Stephen was making this point very strongly, normality has two different connotations. Normal is the norm, but normal is also the most widespread. Not taking bribes in Bulgaria is normal because it is a norms. Taking bribes is also normal because many people are doing it. So how you're basically dealing with this? You have two ways. One is to stop taking bribes, to become as a norm. The other is to say that Austrians also take bribes, but they're doing it more skillfully. So we are normal because they are the same. And I do believe this type of psychological mechanism dealing with schizophrenia of normality is something that was very important for us.
Let me raise two quick questions, then I want to go out into the audience. One of them relates to the migration issue. In an article, I can't remember whether it's in the book as well, you say populist rage in Central and Eastern Europe was directed less at multiculturalism than at individualism and cosmopolitanism. It's just something I didn't understand. I wondered whether you were just giving the populist an alibi, because you could make an argument that one of the things you said just a minute ago, that the model, the Western model that Eastern Europe was asked to emulate turned out to be much more secular than they expected, much more individualistic, but it also turned out to be much more multicultural than, and so you get a strong sense that conservatives in Poland, conservatives in the Czech Republic, conservatives in Hungary look at Paris, London, Berlin and think, whatever this is, we don't want that. We don't want the demography we can see when we go there. We don't want it not because we're racist or whatever. We don't want it because it brings terrorism, whatever. But that means they don't like multiculturalism. So I'm not quite clear why you're exempting the...
Our friend Jacques Rupnik said he arrived in Prague, and the taxi driver said, "You come from Paris, it must be terrible there. We've read Houellebecq, so we know what it's like." That's kind of a madness. So I think there are many ways to get at this, but one way has to do, and I think listening to you, I realize you're in a battle. You're here on the ground in a battle, a political battle. And Ivan and I are a little bit above the chessboard here, so we're not actually seeing things in the same way. It's not to say which was the best way to look at it, but one way in which to understand the gap between an intellectual elite and ordinary voters for right-wing populists is to say that everyone has an impulse toward homogeneity. And I personally like to be around people who've seen the same movies I have, read the same books, or educated like me. I don't care anything about their passport or their ethnicity at all. To me, that's meaningless. Yeah. So then I look at other people in the society who are working class people, and I say, well, why can't you have the same indifference to homogeneity that I do? But of course, I have a different homogeneity. So so it's not so I think the way of thinking about individualism, and so I'm an individualist because as long as you have a PhD, I'm fine with you. I don't care if you're from Canada or whatever, or Kenya or anywhere else. So there's a kind of parochialism of the multicultural elite that is happy with and is pleased at being able to be comfortable in a multicultural setting. It's fine for us, and that's resented by people who think we're looking down on them because we have our own homogeneity and they don't. So anyway, I'm saying that's individualism, universalism is viewed as a particularism by some groups. So our universalism, this is an old Marxist thing, universalism is the particularism of the rich or something like that. Right. So we are so superior because we are not prejudiced. But of course, we live rather insulated lives too. So that's one answer anyway.
Just two things. One is that this is very interesting comparing with the communist period. In the communist period, elites pretended that they morally envy the people. You're intellectual, but the working class are really the good people. You want to be honest like them and courageous like them. And of course it was not true, but it is good to hear it. And suddenly, basically now the idea is, I'm the elite, and those who are not like me, not simply that they're wrong, but they're morally worse people. The famous basket of deplorable that came with Hillary Clinton is critically important. So in a certain way, this is important because in a democracy, we're very different. Some people are smarter, some people are richer, but it's very important that the experience of everybody is equally valuable. If our experiences are not equally valuable, this kind of a system cannot function. You probably are much smarter than me, but I know better how I feel, I know better what is best for me, and this is how the system is organized. So from this point of view, I do believe what is happening, and this is why the migration is very important. We make this in the book, and this was always kind of my strong argument. The fear in Central and Eastern Europe is not so much of the foreigners coming, because there are not many coming, and I'm always giving my favorite Hungarian data. There are more Hungarians, according to the public opinion poll, paid by the Hungarian government. There are more Hungarians who claim that personally they have seen an unidentified flying objects in their life than those who said that personally that they have encountered a refugee. So the most important story is not the fear of the people coming, but the fear of the people living. Central and Eastern Europe lost around 6% of its population for the last 30 years. The combination between the low fertility rates and out-migration produced, and Bulgaria is one of the classical examples, a loss of almost 2 million people. It's not simply that people are leaving, but most of the people who are leaving are younger people, and you start in these small nations to believe that historically you are doomed. When you listen to the nationalistic rhetoric of somebody like Viktor Orban, for example, his minister Lazar coming here, not far away from here, and saying there is no Vienna, this is like in the Middle East, there are doner kebabs everywhere, and so on and so on. The major story is you are not stopping people who are not coming, and there are not many coming to Bulgaria. I didn't see a Syrian dreaming to come to Bulgaria, basically. The major story is to stop your own people living, and to stop your people living, telling them, if you want to live in Europe, you should stay in your own country because Western Europe is not Europe anymore. And this is like the problem with the Berlin Wall. Most of our countries face the same problem GDR faced in 1961. Because of the situation of the labor market, which also produced the famous slavery law in Hungary, you have a situation in which we simply lack labor. And on the other side, all the legitimacy of the government is based on the fact that they are not going to allow foreigners to come. So from this point of view, you should persuade your own people that leaving should not happen. It didn't work. In fact, more people have left Hungary for the last 10 years than after 1956. Not all of them are leaving for political reasons. I don't want to make it speculative. Many people left for economic reasons and others. But this is a major story. So out-migration is something that for us was very important. This is the story with multiculturalism. All of them are going to say we're against multiculturalism. And our point with Stephen is it's not simply about multiculturalism. Individualism itself is a problem. Even if you're going to tell in Poland, you have 2 million Ukrainians now, and they're quite received quite well and so on. They're part of the labor market. But this is a people who don't believe that individualism is good for society. They do believe that individualism is going to destroy social cohesion.
Okay, I think what we need to do, because I've run this a little because the conversation got so lively, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So a question is a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. And just in case you didn't know what a question was, some people don't. And one per customer, and wait for the microphone. Can I see some hands? Anybody wants to ask a question? We got two down. We got three. Okay, we got three on this side. What's the matter with this side? You guys shy?
There's one.
There's one over there. Okay, so let's far right there. Right.
Yes.
Perhaps you could just as a courtesy identify yourself. That would be great.
Yes, of course. My name is Jan Sowa. I'm a Polish sociologist, currently visiting scholar at the IWM. I would like to refer to a part of your work that has not been discussed so much, which is the agency of people in the East. I think it's very important also for understanding current populist situation. People actually want populism. This is something we need to explain. Yeah. So my question, however, would go back to 1989 and the desire that people had at this time. I totally agree that when you say that we wanted what happened in terms of transformation, capitalism, etc. Polish left-wing economist Tadeusz Kowalik put it in a very precise and concrete terms. He said, Western intellectuals, Jeffrey Sachs, David Lipton, they arrived with a proposal. However, this proposal was accepted eagerly by the Polish side. So it's not a question of conspiracy, manipulation, etc. However, and here's my question, what do you think about it? It's not as simple as saying, be careful what you wish for because it may turn out to be true, because actually the capitalism and the social order that was built in Poland, Eastern Europe, after '89 was not any kind of replica or imitation of the Western capitalism. It was a very vicious experiment with a very limited welfare state, low share of wages in GDP, limited public sector, etc., etc. So it's not that people got what they wanted and they became disappointed. They got something that did not exist at that time. And here again, I think we're coming back to this idea of a past future that Ivan evoked. It was a kind of an experiment, a laboratory for the future of capitalism at that time. So what do you think about it?
I'll just say, so one big difference between 1945 and 1989 is that in 1945, in Germany, West Germany, the Americans were exporting a social compact kind of capitalism in which the state and the market were very much balanced, and you brought union members into the direction of firms and so forth. By 1989, there's been liberalism had changed its shape. It had become much less, there had been much more emphasis on unregulated market. But of course, it wasn't in the West. Mind you, in the West, the unregulated market that existed in the West produced 2008. So that was already a pathological system. But you're right, a lot of what happened in 1989 was do what we say, not what we do. It was exporting even a kind of exaggerated, abstracted version, but still, the liberalism in the West was a mess, which we now know because of 2008.
Just one sentence, because you're absolutely right. The welfare state was the thing that we wanted to imitate, and the message was you cannot afford this. But here comes the first kind of a reaction. Some of the liberal economists, for example, particularly Balcerowicz case, because he knew how difficult it is to be the imitator, he, before Orban, said, you're going to imitate us. So in a certain way, he said, our societies, our economies are much more liberal than the Western ones. So it's going to be Germany imitating Poland when it comes to the labor markets and this and that. We are much more competitive. So this story of living in the world in which political imperative is imitate, but the cultural imperative is be original. This was present very early on. And Balcerowicz said it before basically Orban believed that everybody is going to imitate him.
There was a question over here. Am I right? Yes. Yes.
And Stefan was
And then we'll come back here. Yeah.
My name's Mark. I'm English. I'm Jewish. Anti-Brexit, suspicious of the charges of anti-Semitism made against the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn recently, which fed into the recent election. And it's a genuine question about what's going on in my country, because I'm not sure. On the one hand, I'm deeply suspicious about the charges of anti-Semitism. I haven't found any substance in the reporting by the BBC. On the other hand, I'm not sure if I'm deeply naive, because nobody has a go at me for being Jewish. That's why I'm prepared to get up and say that here. So my question is, what's going on in my country as far as anti-Semitism is concerned? Last week I met an Orthodox educated Jewish woman that told me she used to vote Green, and a few weeks ago she voted for the Conservatives, Boris Johnson, and there's this huge change. So it clearly worked.
Okay, maybe we need to reframe that as a question about, because we've been having a discussion about somewhere else. I think we can reframe that question as a question about anti-Semitism and its place in the story that the two of you have been telling. Is there anything you want to say there?
Stephen,
I mean, I have nothing to say about the British case, however fascinating it is to everyone, outside observers, but there is an anti-Semitism growing in the United States, which is extraordinarily shocking, really. And in the US, when you talk about anti-elite, anti-establishment, that means the New York Times, that means Hollywood, that is heavily flavored with the Jewish something. So anti-Semitism is, of course, different than other forms of racism because it's a conspiracy theory, as opposed to just being kind of looking at inferiors. And that's part of the way we're thinking about this anti-liberal disorder in the world is that it is infused with conspiracy thinking. So in that sense, there's something of this going on. I mean, obviously we're all interested in the relation between, say, Netanyahu and Orban, the fact that Netanyahu has sort of made himself like the lawyer for the East European populists, no matter how anti-Semitic they are. So there is something in the anti-Semitism story that is relevant. We don't write about it. I don't think either of us really are experts in it, but I think, I'm not saying anything about Corbyn or about the Labour Party in Britain, but it's a mental illness. You know, anti-Semitism is a mental illness of some kind. There's something, when that flares up, there's something going wrong deeply in the society, and it's happening in the US in ways I never expected to see, because of course this is the country, maybe like Canada, in which Jews have been enormously successful and enormously integrated. But you know, being integrated doesn't mean you're not going to become a target, which they are becoming more and more. And I'm living in France a lot of the time. It's amazing. My partner has a son who's half Jewish. I go to the place where he's trained as a child pioneer. I'm told by all these big guys, I can't stand outside on the street because they're afraid I'm going to be machine gunned by someone, pulling through with a van. That is and there's no markings on a building. It's there's something going on here with this creeping return of anti-Semitism, which is very frightening.
Just a sentence, because there is an interesting story on the level of the regimes, not on the level of society, and I cannot talk about UK, but in Central and Eastern Europe, of course, not necessarily the leaders. I don't believe that, for example, Mr. Kaczynski personally is anti-Semitic, but many of their voters basically are anti-Semitic. But at the same time, these parties and regimes are very strongly pro-Israelis, not simply in the banal kind of a geopolitical sense. Paradoxically, they see Israel, Netanyahu's Israel, as the dream of East European interwar nationalism coming true. You have a small country, which basically is an ethnic democracy, which is economically extremely successful, and not simply extremely successful, but successful in a very much highly technological way. Thirdly, this is the only kind of a small East European country that is self-sustainable when it comes to security. We're talking about a nuclear power, and also which tries to place in a high league with everybody else, plus the only country that managed to reverse the demographic decline. And from this point of view, there is a fascination with Israel and Netanyahu, which goes beyond kind of a tactical story. We are doing this, we are doing that, particularly with Netanyahu. I do believe that if there is a model for East European leaders that we are talking about, it cannot be Putin and it cannot be Trump. So to be absolutely honest, the size of the country matters, as Montesquieu has noticed. So believing that Bulgaria can imitate a Russian regime, you need some oil in order to do it. But I do believe Israel is the model.
Is the model. We had there's a question right here.
My name is Anton Shekhovtsov, teaching at the University of Vienna, former fellow of the IWM. I have a question regarding the geography of the book. Because basically, if we look at the chessboard from the above, then we cannot fail to notice that the populist wave or the nativist wave is not confined to Central Eastern Europe. We have cases like the former government here in this country, in Austria, where the far right was in the government. Then we had a case of Italy. We have Brexit, where nativism basically decided the referendum vote. Then we have EKRE in Estonia, also can be considered part of the West now. So this is a global movement. This is a global phenomenon. Why focus on Central Eastern Europe, talking about imitation, where we have now President Bolsonaro in Brazil. Trump is not an exception. Central Europe and Eastern Europe are not an exception. It's a global wave.
Modi in India.
In India. So why focus just why to take one part of the geography and focus on this particular?
No, it's a good point. I mean, why didn't we write another book? Is another way to put it. But yeah, of course. So we focused. I mean, in a way, it seemed like the beginning of this anti-liberal wave was in the countries where the anti-liberals took power. I mean, Salvini, as you know, is not in power now. He may be. We'll find out. I don't. Putting Boris Johnson in this category, I think, is probably a stretch. But you're right. Salvini's language is identical to Orban's. He says, Brussels, these are our bosses, these are our masters, and he somehow attributes to them the shrinking demography of Italy. Now, why would that be? I don't really. He says, and Italians are leaving. We're losing our working age young people. And we're having no babies. This is our problem. This is Salvini's language. It's the same. So you're right. There are parallels, and I think it would be in a sense, the limits of maybe part of just focus. But of course, we believe that the analysis we're trying to make should bring us this, we should find the Ariadne's thread through the labyrinth that brings us to these other examples. If we could do it. We haven't done it yet. Maybe we should write another book on that topic.
You know the reason why people are basically looking for the key under the lamp when they lost it. First of all, there is a kind of constraint of our knowledge. But there was also a much more structural idea. Central and Eastern Europe was perceived as the key laboratory for the post-Cold War world. If you go to people like Fukuyama and others, if you see basically the democratization theory, Central and Eastern Europe was very important because this was the model which you also believe that is going to go everywhere. America for us was extremely important because this was the most unexpected of all. Italy, France, it's everything there, but the United States was basically the model. And Russia was for us very important also because of the geopolitical dimensions and the nature of it. There is one country that we put there simply for structural reasons, where none of us is an expert on, and this is China. And we put China as the last chapter because our major argument was that unlike all the countries that we talk about, China always insisted that they are not part of the Age of Imitation. They said, we only borrow. We never imitate. We don't want to be like you. Everything is with the Chinese characteristics. And from us, this was quite important because this is also what we claim in this chapter is that not simply the Chinese made an ideology out of the fact that we are not imitating the West, that we are going to have Communist Party ruling, nevertheless, that basically there was not much of a communist economy around, but also the idea of dominating the world is not based on the idea that you want others to be a replica of yours. China is pushing for asymmetrical relationship with everybody else, but China, and as you can see it very clearly now in the relations with different European and non-European countries, I'm not interested in what your government is to the extent that you're going to follow my priorities. It's much more through technology, through kind of economic dependencies and others. So from this point of view, China is very different than Soviet Union, but also China is very different than Mao's China, which was the biggest exporter of ideology in a certain way.
Peasant revolution.
Yeah, so this is why we decided to risk and to come with this China chapter, knowing how.
But it's not just that they don't want to be imitated. They are, and you saw that with Tiananmen, and you see this now with Hong Kong. They are afraid that their people will want to imitate the West.
Yeah.
There's a fear of leadership, and this is true with Putin. He's afraid that Russians might imitate Maidan. So there's a fear that those under you will have this imitative impulse. So that's another way. This concept of imitation is just wonderful because it's so malleable. You can do many things with it. It can take you into many rooms of the palace. But I think that's it's important to see that. I mean, the Tiananmen events were the kids and the students and the work. They built a Statue of Liberty, basically, in Tiananmen Square, and that's what freaked out the leadership. This is impossible. We can't allow. That's Americanization, and we have to crush it. So there's a fear of imitation, which I think is part of the dynamic of authoritarianism today.
Just a little footnote on that point, because it's relevant to a university setting. What is the university that the Orban government has welcomed into Budapest while they simultaneously expel CU? It's Fudan. What did Fudan do to its charter of incorporation in December? It removed the words academic freedom and institutional autonomy from its charter and substituted respect for the leading line of the Communist Party of China. This is the institution. So two messages from that. We might once have thought of emulating American higher education. We are not going to do that, number one. And number two, when we export ourselves, we're exporting ourselves in a model that is radically different from the canon and standards of academic freedom that are characteristic of that. And that's the university that will replace us in Budapest.
Wow.
That's the world you're in, folks, 2020. I think we've got
I hope
time.
they're not going to get the building.
They're not going to get the building. I think we've got time for, we're really at the end here, a question here.
Stefan?
And then we'll have a wrap-up comment from these folks. And then we're going to have, just in case I forget, we're going to have a reception afterwards, just through there. So we give you a drink as well. It's a full-service outfit. Okay.
Thank you. I read your book with great enjoyment, and I agreed with a lot of it. And then I read another book, and that was a very good history of the 19th century. And I read it basically having your thesis in mind. And it seemed to me this was just as much an age of imitation as the era that you described. And all the mechanism you described, the revolt against imitation, the manipulation of imitation, there are numerous examples from the 19th century. So basically, I came away from this is basically that imitation is one of the most powerful forces of world history. And I would think reading this book through the prism of your book, basically, I came away with the belief that imitation is one of the most positive forces of world history, and ask you whether that you agree with that.
Isaiah Berlin, basically describing the German Romanticism, basically said this was the reaction against imitating the Germans, the French. Universalism of the classical period. So one of our major arguments is that people imitate all the time. We basically have been quoting Tardet, who said imitation is the other name for society. What was interesting for us was that there was a very specific type of imitation that came after 1989. It was institutional, it was a full package, it was very much based on demand. So from this point of view, it was not imposition. From this point of view, it was totally different. It was the soft power in a certain way of it. And also, we do believe, from this point of view, this is not a particularly pessimistic book. For those of you who are never going to read it, the title, The Light That Failed, is the title of the first novel that Kipling wrote. And we liked it because the book has two different versions. His mother, who was a wise person, insisted that there should be a positive ending. So he had one version which was shorter and with a happy end. And the other was a longer and with not so happy end. So for us it's very much open. And we do believe that resentment is part of the imitation in the same way basically imitation is part of the way societies develop. And for us this is why it was quite important to understand that we do not have a type of a clash of ideological type which we have in the Cold War. Mr. Orban is not the Brezhnev of the 21st century. It's not simply because of the power and so on that Hungary is not the Soviet Union, but also because at the end of the day we're talking about a reactionary regime which is much more based on psychological reaction and mobilizing kind of a resentment of this kind than coming with an alternative, which Soviets were an alternative. People can like or dislike, but they have a different idea of society. So from this point of view, yes, we do believe that basically this resentment is also a stage which is going to be overcome. You're going to see a post-populist politics, and you're seeing in many countries, I do believe in these countries too, in which we are. From this point of view also, we're not highly deterministic. We don't know how it's going to happen, because it can go this way or that way. As we have in the book, the future is the invasion of the unknown.
So, of course, I mean, imitation is ubiquitous. One of the differences between animal evolution and human evolution is human beings borrow things from other societies, which animals don't really do. That's a kind of so I think this is true. But the Cold War period had a particular characteristic, which is that the Soviets were trying to create replica regimes, with an org bureau and so on around the world, and the U.S. created a kind of democracy. It was a competition between two systems that were trying to create replica regimes in a global conflict. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was just one regime left, and it continued on this line of trying to create replica regimes. So I think it's peculiar, but of course you're right. It's one of the wonderful things about the idea of imitation is how many roads it can take you down. So just one little comment here about the U.S., because we didn't talk much about that, is the very common phrase now on the populist right of white lives matter. That's obviously just imitating the victim status of Black Lives Matter. And it's taking on, oh, you're a victim, you get some kind of privileges, I'm going to become you. And when the all-powerful majority starts thinking of itself as a victim, this is part of what you're saying, that's when things are very dangerous. And then the last point about pessimism, populism is going to produce its own discontents. It's already doing that. There's no way it's not going to do that. And part of that's why it keeps trying to claim it's in opposition. Because and over time, that's implausible. If you stay in power for enough time, people will realize, no, you are in power. And the discontent is natural to human psychology will turn against you.
I think that's the note on which we should draw this fascinating conversation to a conclusion. I want to thank Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes for a bunch of things. This is a really important book. There you are, The Light That Failed. Get it at your local bookstore. It's worth buying, it's worth reading. I think the other thing to say about the book, as I think you saw at tonight's discussion, these are serious thinking people doing something that serious thinking people often don't do, which is taking the care to think and communicate clearly to a non-specialist audience. And that's a good deed in a bad old world. And so I want to thank Ivan and Stephen and invite all of you, thank you for coming, and invite you to the reception back door where we'll give you a glass of wine. Thank you so much for coming.